Most people believe that the fall of the Third Reich was a slow, agonizing grind of industrial attrition, an inevitable result of being crushed between the Soviet hammer and the Allied anvil. We are taught that D-Day was an unstoppable tide of liberation. But the hidden truth is that the most formidable defensive system in human history was undone not by a superior strategy, but by a pair of gray suede shoes and a birthday party at home. The Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, the very man tasked with making the Atlantic Wall impenetrable, wasn't at his post when the first landing craft hit the sand. He was hundreds of miles away, celebrating his wife's 50th birthday. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was a final, fatal glitch in a systemic collapse of command. History tells us the Allies won the beach. The data tells us the Germans lost the clock. By 1944, the old world of German military supremacy had become a geological statement of paranoia. The Atlantic Wall was an infrastructure of concrete, a 2,000-mile-long fortress that looked invincible on a map but was rotting from the inside. The status quo of the German High Command was a nightmare of overlapping authorities and fractured sovereignty. You had two competing philosophies for the defense of Europe. Field Marshal von Rundstedt believed in a mobile reserve, letting the Allies land and then hitting them with a massive counterattack. Rommel, the forgotten architect of the beach defense, saw the balance sheet of reality. He knew that once the Allied air forces achieved total supremacy, nothing would move on the ground. The common solution of a deep defense was a death sentence. To Rommel, the only logic of survival was to win the war in the first 24 hours at the water's edge. But the German infrastructure of command was intentionally broken. Hitler, fearful of a military coup, had created a system where no single general had total control. The Panzer divisions, the only thing that could actually throw the Allies back into the sea, were locked behind a vacuum of authority. Some reported to Rommel, some to Rundstedt, and the most powerful were held in OKW reserve, meaning they couldn't move without a direct order from Hitler himself. This was the structural flaw that turned the Atlantic Wall from a fortress into a cage. The Germans had the raw metal, but they lacked the logic of initiative. They were waiting for a storm, but they were looking at the wrong map. Rommel's hidden strategy was a blueprint for a perfect defense. He had spent months turning the French coastline into a nightmare of Erwin. Rommel's asparagus, millions of underwater obstacles and mines designed to gut landing craft at high tide. His roadmap was simple. If the enemy stays on the beach for more than an hour, the Reich is dead. He was a man obsessed with logistics, yet he was trapped in a system that prioritized loyalty over efficiency. In early June, the weather in the English Channel was a chaotic vacuum. German meteorologists, lacking the advanced weather station network the Allies had in the North Atlantic, predicted weeks of storms. They told the High Command that a landing was statistically impossible. Rommel, exhausted and sensing a window of safety, saw an opportunity to fulfill a personal logic. June 6th was his wife Lucy's 50th birthday. He left the front on June 4th, carrying a pair of handmade shoes bought in Paris, the most expensive gift in history. He believed the weather had granted him a temporary sovereignty over his own time. He wasn't the only one. Many divisional commanders were also away at war games in Rennes. The Desert Fox was at home in Germany, and the ghost army we discussed earlier was doing its job perfectly, keeping the rest of the German focus on the Pas de Calais. The tragedy of execution occurred in the early hours of June 6th. As the first paratroopers descended into the darkness of Normandy, the German response was paralyzed by a systemic silence. Rommel was in Ulm, hundreds of miles from the water's edge he had sworn to protect. When the reports of the landings reached the High Command, the vacuum of leadership became a death trap. Rundstedt wanted to move the Panzers immediately, but he didn't have the authority. The men who did have the authority were too afraid to wake Hitler, who had taken a sedative and was sleeping at Berchtesgaden. The blueprint for the defense of Europe required a single, decisive mind at the center of the web. Instead, there was nothing. By the time Rommel raced back to the front and Hitler finally authorized the movement of the tanks in the afternoon, The infrastructure of the invasion was already set. The Allied bridgehead was no longer a hope. It was a reality. The 24-hour window Rommel had identified as the logic of victory had slammed shut while he was presenting a pair of shoes. The tragedy wasn't that the plan was bad. It's that the plan required an omnipresence that a fractured dictatorship could never provide. This event left a permanent vacuum in the history of the war. After the failure of D-Day, Rommel's disillusionment with Hitler's logic reached its breaking point, leading to his involvement in the July 20th plot and his subsequent forced suicide. The modern world was shaped not by the soldiers who fought, but by the structural absence of the one man who could have stopped them. The modern shadow of Rommel's birthday is seen in every sleeping giant of corporate and political history. We live in a world governed by systemic complexity, where we assume that someone, somewhere, is always watching the monitors. But history shows us that the most vital infrastructures of power are often held together by the thin thread of a single person's presence. When leadership creates a vacuum, whether through arrogance, exhaustion, or a flawed chain of command, the results are catastrophic. Today's green folders are no longer physical documents. They are the digital logs of our own logistical failures. We still operate under the instinct that it can't happen today because the weather isn't right. But the lesson of the shoes and is that the weather is a variable, while structure is a constant. History isn't just about who won or lost. It's really about the everyday stuff, the routines, the birthdays, and even the sleep habits that outlast the empires. The Reich didn't end with a bang. It ended with a man realizing too late that the most expensive gift he ever gave was the time he wasn't there.